Welcome to Illuminati Silver's Inner Sanctum, where we tell you the truth about silver, precious metals, economics, and politics. Today is Friday, the 22nd of February 2019, and we're continuing with our discussion on modern monetary theory and its advocates. Last week's video described what MMT is and what it stands for, and we focused on the views of Robert Nielsen and his views on the subject on an article he wrote back in 2013 in the blog Whistling in the Wind. It's important to be mindful that modern monetary theory is an approach to economic management developed since the 1990s by Australian Professor Bill Mitchell, alongside American academics like Professor Randall Wray, Stephanie Kelton, and investment bankers and fund managers like Warren Mosler. It builds on the ideas of a previous generation of economists, such as Hyman Minsky, Wynne Godley, and Abba Lerner. By the 1980s, most people saw Keynes as an advocate of budget deficits, only during periods of high unemployment. Lerner, as early as 1943, in a paper entitled Functional Finance and the Federal Debt, had argued that Keynesian economics involved running whatever government deficit was necessary to maintain full employment, and that deficits should be seen as the norm. While the theory has attracted its own interpretations and criticisms, it has also gained traction in a global economic environment that continues to defy the efforts of policymakers to restore sustained economic growth. There are three core statements at the heart of modern monetary theory. They are: 1, monetary sovereign governments face no purely financial budget constraints. 2, all economies and all governments face real and ecological limits relating to what can be produced and consumed. And 3, the government's financial deficit is everybody else's financial surplus. Let's elaborate a little. A monetary sovereign government is one with its own currency and central bank, a floating exchange rate, and no significant foreign currency debt. Australia, the UK, the US, and Japan have a monetary sovereign government. The Eurozone countries individually are not monetary sovereigns, as they do not have their own currencies. The second of these statements, which is all economies and governments face real and ecological limits relating to what can be produced and consumed, confirms the fact that governments can cause inflation if they choose, by spending too much themselves or not taxing enough. When this happens, the total level of spending in the economy exceeds what can be produced by all the labor, skills, physical capital, technology, and natural resources which are available. We can also destroy our natural ecosystem if we produce too many of the wrong things or use the wrong processes to produce what we want to consume. If we take the Australian government, for example, it is a currency issuing central government. It cannot run out of Australian dollars. It's never forced to borrow Australian dollars, although it can and does choose to do so. And its debt securities play a useful role in the financial system. So some key points to remember are: taxes exist to limit inflation, not pay for spending. You may remember this was part of the theory explained last week. It's necessary for us to pay taxes to keep total spending, government and private, at a level which will not be inflationary. For every lender, there must be a borrower. That means that across our entire financial system, surpluses and deficits always add up to zero. and for every saver who earns more than they spend, there must be somebody or some institution which spends more than it takes in. If we want the private sector as a whole to save rather than to go further into debt, the government will probably have to spend more than it taxes. Of course, depending on what the rest of the world is doing. So technically, the government cannot run out of dollars, which means that balanced budgets are unnecessary. It also means government deficits can play a supportive role, allowing the private sector to build up savings. Now, redirecting our attention to the United States in particular, there was an interesting article in New Statesman America published just 2 days ago, entitled "The Surprise Cult of Modern Monetary Theory." The article quoted that advocates of this theory include Stephanie Kelton, already mentioned, a former economic advisor to the Democratic US presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, and the maverick UK tax expert Richard Murphy, who argue that once we reshape our perception of money, many of the supposed constraints on government spending disappear. I'm going to quote a couple of paragraphs from this article. Put simply, MMTers believe that most people mistakenly view the economy backwards. Instead of taxing in order to fund spending, states spend first and tax later. Central to this analysis is that sovereign currency is a creation of the state. Rather than finding the money to pay for universal health care, governments can electronically create money out of nothing. When inflation begins to rise, the state can employ its fiscal lever, taxing excess money out of the economy. 2017, Bernie Sanders proposed a free college tuition plan. More recently, Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has expressed sympathy for MMT, has declared her support for a Green New Deal, including dramatic public investment in renewable energy. Republicans typically retort, "But how will you pay for it?" For exponents of MMT ideas, who increasingly flood online debate, this question fundamentally misunderstands how the economy works. There's an ideological framework behind that question. It presupposes that the government doesn't have the money to do these things, Kelton told a lecture hall in 2018 at Stony Brook University, where she holds a professorship. Conservatives have long argued that the government must manage its budget as a household does, tightening its belt by reducing borrowing. For Kelton and others, this analogy is a pernicious fig leaf that obscures the ideological reasons for politicians' fixation on deficit reduction. Opponents of MMT include Bill Gates, who argue it amounts to crazy talk, paving the way for hyperinflation. But Murphy explains a common misconception is that it's about flooding the economy with money, and that's just not true. Those who are committed to MMT are also committed to using taxation to curb inflation. Unquote. Something to think about, and we would suggest that perhaps you play this over again so that you are able to absorb it more deeply. And in next week's video, we shall look at why MMT may not actually work, and most certainly and hopefully put a strong case against it.
Disclaimer. Illuminati silver owners come from a background of banking, international wealth management and economics. Having now retired from these worlds, we are not qualified to give investment advice. Therefore, this and other productions must not be deemed to be giving such advice and merely represent the personal views of its owners.